So, how do we actually put a concrete number on something as wildly complex, abstract, and deeply personal as human intelligence? It's a question that's literally fascinated scientists and philosophers for centuries. I mean, we all know people we'd consider absolutely brilliant, right? And we've all faced tasks that make us feel, well, completely out of our depth. But how do we objectively measure that brain power?
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the assessment of intelligence, specifically deconstructing the history, the math, and the true meaning of the intelligence quotient, or as we all know it, IQ. We're going to look at exactly where this concept came from, how it's calculated, and what it actually tells us about human capability.
Here's our roadmap for today. 1. Measuring the mind. 2. Mental versus biological age. 3. The IQ formula. 4. The bell curve. And 5. Extremes of intelligence.
Section 1. Measuring the mind, the historical quest to quantify intellect.
To figure out how we measure intelligence today, we actually have to go back to the turn of the 20th century. In just a rapid 7-year evolution, psychology was totally transformed. In 1905, Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon made the very first successful attempt to formally measure intelligence. Then, just 3 years later, in 1908, they revised their scale and introduced this groundbreaking concept called mental age. And finally, in 1912, a German psychologist named William Stern took all their work a step further, officially coining the famous term intelligence quotient, or IQ.
Section 2. Mental versus biological age. Separating mind from matter.
To really grasp what an IQ score is, we first have to separate a person's cognitive development from, the actual date on their birth certificate. Binet and Simon gave us the concept of mental age, or MA. This is basically a measure of your intellectual development relative to people in your age group. So what does that actually mean in practice? Well, it simply means that if a child has a mental age of 5, their performance on an intelligence test exactly matches the average performance level of a whole bunch of 5-year-olds. It's an evaluation based purely on capability, completely ignoring the actual passage of time.
Now, contrast that with chronological age, or CA, which is just a person's biological age from birth, literally the number of years you've been alive. By comparing these two metrics, early psychologists could immediately spot someone's developmental trajectory. For a really bright child, their mental age is going to be significantly higher than their chronological age. On the flip side, historically, Binet and Simon defined struggling children, using the clinical terminology of their time, retardation, specifically as having a mental age exactly 2 years below their chronological age.
Section 3. The IQ formula, the math behind the quotient. Let's see how William Stern actually brought these two concepts together. His formulation has this really elegant simplicity to it. IQ equals mental age divided by chronological age multiplied by 100. It is quite literally a quotient, a result you get by dividing one quantity by another. By dividing the mind's age by the body's age, you get this incredibly clean ratio of development.
Now, you might be wondering about that multiplier at the very end. The number 100 is used simply as a practical trick to avoid dealing with annoying decimal points. But more importantly, it creates a super clean, understandable baseline. Because of that 100, whenever a person's mental age perfectly matches their chronological age, the resulting IQ score is exactly 100. So 100 becomes the absolute anchor point for average intelligence, no matter how old you actually are.
Let's see this formula in action with a direct comparison. We've got child A and child B. Both are exactly 10 years old biologically, but child A has a mental age of 12. So 12 divided by 10 is 1.2, multiply that by 100, and you get an IQ of 120. Now look at child B. Same biological age of 10, but a mental age of 7. 7 divided by 10 is 0.7, yielding an IQ of 70. It's wild, right? The exact same biological age results in vastly different scores just based on cognitive development.
All right, let's test this out with a quick mental math puzzle directly from our source material. What is the IQ of a 14-year-old child with a mental age of 16? Well, if you take 16 divided by 14, you get about 1.14. Multiply that by 100, and you get an IQ of roughly 114. The mental age is higher than the chronological age, so the score sits comfortably above that baseline of 100.
Section 4. The bell curve, mapping humanity's intelligence.
So if we take Stern's exact formula and apply it to millions of people all across the globe, what does human intelligence actually look like on a macro level? It creates this highly symmetrical, bell-shaped pattern that we call the normal curve. Notice how the vast majority of us are clustered right there in the middle, creating that massive peak directly over the mean score of 100.
And as you move further away from 100 in either direction towards exceptionally low or exceptionally high scores, the line just drops off drastically. Only a very, very few people possess those extreme scores.
When we break down that central distribution into specific categories, the numbers are pretty striking. A massive 50% of the population falls perfectly into the average IQ range, scoring between 90 and 109. Then, flanking that central group, you've got about 16% in the high average range of 110 to 119, and another 16% in the low average range of 80 to 89. So this central block basically accounts for the overwhelming majority of humanity.
Section 5. Extremes of intelligence, the outer edges of the curve.
Now, let's impartially examine those extreme ends of intellectual functioning. At the furthest edges of our bell curve, we find two distinct groups that actually perfectly mirror each other in size. On one side, we have individuals classified as intellectually disabled, marked by an IQ below 70. That makes up about 2% of the population. On the exact opposite side, we have the intellectually gifted, those with an IQ above 130, which, you guessed it, also accounts for just 2% of the population. These two groups deviate considerably from the norm when it comes to their cognitive and motivational traits.
But it is super important to understand that intellectual disability isn't defined just by a test score. According to the source material, it actually requires 3 concurrent features. First, yes, significantly sub-average functioning, usually an IQ below 70. But second, it absolutely requires observable deficits in adaptive behavior, meaning can this person navigate their everyday environment and live independently? And third, these deficits have to manifest during the developmental period, which is considered to be between birth and 18 years of age.
By contrast, let's look at the characteristics of the intellectually gifted population on the other side of the curve. These folks often display remarkable capacities. We're talking advanced logical thinking, incredibly high speeds when processing information, and an advanced level of original, creative thinking. They also tend to display a super high level of intrinsic motivation, basically a completely self-driven desire to learn, often showing a real preference for solitary academic activities for long stretches of time.
However, as we wrap up our analysis today, we really must keep this quote from our sources in mind. Intelligence can be a potential factor for achievement. One should guard against erroneous practices associated with intelligence tests. An IQ test is a highly practical tool, and it's best interpreted by trained psychologists to identify specific strengths and cognitive deficits. It's a metric of specific problem-solving and logical capacities. But it is absolutely not a measure of a person's total worth, nor is it some guaranteed golden ticket to a successful life.
Which leaves us with a final, kind of provocative thought to chew on. If the IQ formula strictly measures analytical capacity, processing speed, and logical reasoning, what other vital forms of human intelligence are entirely missing from this bell curve? I mean, what about our ability to navigate complex social situations, our emotional intelligence, or our raw artistic creativity? The IQ formula might measure the mind, but measuring the entirety of human capability? Well, that's a much, much larger equation. Thanks for joining us on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.